All right, welcome back. Back in the book of Acts, and we'll be picking it up here at the final verses here in chapter 22 in a moment. So just to recap where we were, Paul had just come off of his final and third missionary journey. He was brought into the temple there where he was under the vow and also to bring alms to his nation. And so then therefore, as he was in the temple or in the courts, the Jews from Asia, specifically those from Antioch of Pisidia, and Derbe and Lystra and elsewhere, basically spotted Paul, and they said, you men of Israel, look, here's this rebel rouser. And they basically stirred up the crowd to the point to where all of Jerusalem was in confusion. And then they started whooping up on Paul, beating him, attempting to try to kill him. And then therefore word had gotten back to the centurion, and they had to rush down from Antonia, the fortress there, to rescue Paul and drag him and pull him out of the crowd there. Whereas Paul then at that point asked permission from the centurion to speak and address the crowd, and then therefore he would lay out his case. And whereas he would speak in Hebrew, and they were all tracking along until he mentioned the word Gentiles, and then they just lost it, and then commenced to screaming and yelling and fighting and so forth, and wanted to pull him back. So the centurion had to drag him back up into the fortress there. So that's kind of where we left off. And so the centurion was getting ready to basically beat the truth out of Paul with whips, and Paul was like, hold on a minute, I'm a Roman here. And word had gotten back to the centurion, and then therefore he was afraid at that point, because if Paul wanted to press the issue, then this Roman officer would have been in serious trouble with the law and with Caesar, being that he had bound him uncondemned. So that's kind of where we left off there. And so we'll pick it up here in chapter 20, or actually chapter 23, and we'll read the last verse of 22 there, where Paul is getting ready to be before the council there. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priest and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set them before them. In chapter 23, and looking intently, that being Paul, at the council, this would have been the Sanhedrin, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God and in all good conscience up to this day. And he had. Verse 2, and the high priest Ananias, and so just a little bit of feedback on Ananias. He was not a high priest appointed by God. Okay, he was appointed by one of the Herods, so therefore making him a fake high priest, only put there in position there as well. So not necessarily a good guy according to history there. And so the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. I don't know what you would have done in that position, but I don't think that would have went well with Paul. And I don't think it does go over well with Paul based on what he says next here in verse 3. And then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? And yet, contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? And so Paul uses this reference, the whited wall or the whitewashed wall, being that it's an idiom for hypocrisy. inasmuch as that you would have a wall that was freshly painted white to cover up the dingy dirt in the old paint. Therefore, a stormy rain or a rain would come down and wash the paint off the wall. They're revealing the hypocrisy there. You can pull from this reference also from Ezekiel chapter 13, okay, concerning the false prophets that teach their people to fly, all right, from Ezekiel chapter 13. Also, Christ mentions it as well in Matthew chapter 23 concerning the scribes and the Pharisees, Matthew chapter 23, verse 27. Just a little bit more in history with as far as Ananias concerning him. After he is out of office, it will come to pass about the year 66 AD that through the Great Revolt and through the rise of the Sicarii, the dagger men that we learned about, that he will actually be killed and murdered as well by the Sicarii, okay, because of his unscrupulous and his collaborations with the Romans. So he'll get his eventually, all right. And so payday does come. And so, but, and then verse 4, and those that stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? Well, he's not technically or officially a Levite, and most likely Paul knows that he's a fake, all right, based on what he says. And so using perhaps, in my opinion, probably an example of dramatic irony, in the sense of how that the readers and Paul himself knows the irony of this, and therefore he says, Paul said, I did not know, brothers. And you can take that in whatever vein you wish, whether it be sarcasm or just kind of pleading a little bit of ignorance. And so I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Okay, so being that was written in Exodus chapter 22, verse 28. And so Paul basically changes tactics and starts to use wisdom at this point. In verse 6, now, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees, being those that did not believe in the resurrection, and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Period. And when he has said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. So again, Paul using his wisdom, seeing that this would cause that division to take the pressure off of him, and then therefore they would basically be in a derision among themselves. Verse 7, and when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And so, in the and with the Sadducees themselves, they would have been considered the higher court, all right, whereas the Pharisees would be more in line with the messianic prophecies, and also in line with the fact that there is life after death, okay? And so verse 9, and then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees partly stood up and contended sharply. We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? In other words, if that were the case, who are we to basically fight against God if that was the case? And therefore, we agree with his accession, with his reasoning that there is hope and the resurrection of the dead. Okay. And so verse 10, and when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down to take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. In other words, back into the barracks of the Fort Antonia. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." And so taking heart and faith in that statement, Paul will draw upon that many times in the upcoming chapters. In one chapter, he'll be snake bit. He'll basically shake it off. Chapter 27, there will be a great shipwreck. He'll come to understand that none of them will die. He's going to take great comfort in this and courage. Okay. All right. Because that would be his duty, inasmuch as we discovered from a previous book in the book of Romans, how that Paul had basically laid down his case to the Ephesians that he was not going to come back to this area, for he had set his eyes on Rome, and Christ confirms that he will be in Rome. Okay. And so verse 12, and when it was day, the Jews, and you can probably most likely include a lot of Kenites within the Jews, which they made a plot, a conspiracy, and bound themselves by an oath, this being in the Greek, a curse. So you have to kind of ask yourself, what kind of people are these people? Religious fruitcakes and nuts is what they are. All right. And so they bound themselves by a curse, neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Well, looks like the diet plan is going to be on, and they're probably not going to be able to fulfill that oath. And so, for there were more than 40, and 40 being in biblical numerics, probation, who made this conspiracy. And when they went to the chief priest and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath or curse to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now, therefore, you, along with the council, that being the Sanhedrin, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you are going to determine his case more exactly." So basically trying to get the tribune to bring Paul down so that they can, under the pretense of saying, "Hey, we want to find out a little bit more about his religion and belief system here." Okay. But, and so, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near. Now, it just so happens, as many times, that there is always, God is always aware, and he is in control. And it just so happens, coincidentally, okay, if you like, but most likely not. Verse 16, now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Okay, therefore, basically showing that Paul had generous visitation privileges. Okay, and Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and, going aside, asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for there are more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him and have bound themselves with an oath neither to eat nor drink until they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent. All right. So if there is ever a good definition of premeditated murder from Deuteronomy chapter 19, that would be it, lying in wait. Okay. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him to tell no one that you have informed me of these things. Okay. And so the next steps that will be taking place is that basically Paul is going to be pawned off or sent to Felix the governor. All right. Verse 23, then he called two of the centurions and said, get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. Okay. And so being that the definition of this, the tribune there, having that he would have a force under his command at Fort Antonia, being approximately around 1,000 men. Okay. It's interesting to see that basically Claudius Lysias essentially sends about half of his force to protect Paul to take him to Caesarea, okay, being that it would be the third hour of the night. So you have to think about in the evening, okay, at 6 o'clock plus 3 would be about 9 o'clock. All right. So, and also provide mounts for Paul to ride and to bring him safely to Felix the governor. All right. And so Josephus records Felix as one that his rule was defined as with severe harshness and disaster that basically plunged Judah into corruption and chaos, also given rise to the Sicarii that would later follow in those days as well. Okay. So, and he wrote a letter to this effect, Claudius Lysias, that being the tribune, to his excellency, the governor Felix, Antonius Felix. Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. And when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen, and desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. In other words, these were matters of religious laws and beliefs rather than any Roman civil laws. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. And so the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Okay. This being about a 35-mile trip, about midway between Jerusalem and Caesarea, being that Caesarea would have been approximately about 62 miles from Jerusalem. Okay, so a difficult journey, a difficult march, but certainly not impossible, especially in the cool of the night. And so you might recall from chapter 10 that Peter also made the same trip when he had met with Cornelius there. And so, and on the next day, they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with them. And when they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. And on reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, meaning that the governor at that point would have learned that Paul's citizenship and his case was essentially within his jurisdiction, and then therefore haven't given him the right to have to see over this case. In verse 35, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. Okay. How are we doing on time here? We'll try to get through most of this. We'll continue on in chapter 24. Paul before Felix at Caesarea. And so after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some of the elders and spoke with one spokesman, one Tertullus, being that he would be basically a big city slick lawyer. And they laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, and you'll note that he's going to use a lot of flattery here. Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation. In every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. Okay. And so this being basically having little resemblance to reality, because it was under Felix that they had the least peaceful terms of any up to this point. Okay. And so in every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly, for we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots, being one among the Jews throughout the world, and is two, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and three, he even tried to profane the temple. Okay. And so, but we seized him, conveniently not mentioning the fact that they were beating him to death at the time there in chapter 21. And so he says, but we seized him, and you can insinuate that we would have judged him according to our law, but your centurion, your tribune there interfered. Okay. Now Paul will deny the first charge there, that one that stirs up riots, and he'll deny also the third charge, being that he tried to profane the temple. Okay. The only one that he will acknowledge will be the fact that he is accepting the fact that he is of the sect of the Nazarenes, meaning that of Jesus of Nazareth. Okay. So verse 8, by examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything from which we accuse him. Verse 9, the Jews also joined in the charge. Amen, brother. Yes, 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 yes. Amen. The deacon boards and the amen crowds and the Jews that joined in, these fruitcakes that were trying to charge him with a crime that was no crime. And they were affirming all of these things that were so, all being lies. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have been judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. Not any flattery, just straight to the point. And you can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. And so part of Paul's defense is that he would not even had enough time to organize a revolt during this period of 12 days or less. Okay. And they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. And so lack of any proof or wrongdoing. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets. And so Paul's basically saying that his defense was amounted to a religious dispute rather than a civil or a political one. Okay. And so having a hope in God, which these men themselves, being the Pharisees, accept that there will be a resurrection, both of the just and the unjust. And so I always take pains to have a clear conscience before God and man. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms, or you might update that to be gifts to the poor, alms to my nation, and to present offerings. Okay. Probably most likely understood after Christ, as Paul would have understood from Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, being that he did not require any more burnt offerings, but then he wanted your sacrifice, meaning your love. Okay. And so while I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, and so Paul basically cuts it short here, realizing that they're not even here. Okay. And then he continues on, they ought to be here before you, and to make an accusation should they have anything against me, or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found me when I stood before the council. Other than this one thing, I cried out while standing among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. Okay. For a religious belief question. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, that being of Christianity, he put them off, meaning he adjourned the court proceedings and saying that when Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case. And then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but to have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. And after some days, Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. And when I get an opportunity, I will summon you. So this, what Paul said, basically caused him a little bit of anxiety. And so he just had to kind of push Paul away to get away from that. And so, and then at the same time, in other words, while he was doing this, being that he was known to, give bribes and so forth. At the same time, he had hoped that money would be given him by Paul. In other words, he was hoping that Paul would accept a bribe or a plea deal or a plea bargain. And so he sent him often. He sent for him often and conversed with him. Okay. And to complete, when 2 years had elapsed, so Paul remained there for 2 years, and then therefore Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Paul left Paul in prison. So still in the midst of the trial that we're in, it will continue to build into chapter 25, and ultimately Paul will realize that he's being cornered, and he will have and be forced to make his cry and appeal to Caesar to get out of this hung jury and hung court here, this kangaroo court that's being brought to pass. All right, so good place to stop. I hope you enjoyed that. Just continue on with Paul's journey, but as a food for thought, take these things and understand how that Paul used his wisdom to basically circumvent the religious crowd, because that may come up to your advantage, as we know that many will be delivered up, as it speaks about that in Luke chapter 12. Go read it. All right. So hope you enjoyed it. Take care. See you next time. God bless. All right.